At 6:40 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on June 21, 2025, 2:10 in the morning in Iran, the lead B-2 over Fordow released the first two GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators of a strike package that would drop 14 bunker busters across Fordow and Natanz, launch more than 24 Tomahawks at Esfahan, and employ roughly 75 precision-guided weapons with more than 125 American aircraft in support. By 7:05 p.m. Eastern Time, the attack was over. The immediate military consequence was severe visible damage at all three sites. The immediate political consequence was even faster. Before any final battle damage assessment existed, the word obliterated had already become policy, message, and test of loyalty. This was the first front Donald Trump began to lose. Not the air corridor, not the weapons release sequence, the narrative. According to verified sources, General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, described initial damage as extremely severe, and then added the crucial limiting clause. Final battle damage would take time, and it was too early to say what capability remained. That difference matters. It is the difference between military reporting and political theater, between an assessment and a slogan. When a commander says assessment is pending and a president says total destruction is settled fact, the conflict moves into a different battle space. It becomes a contest over credibility, and credibility obeys harder physics than campaign rhetoric. Subscribe to the channel right now because the pace at which developments diverge from official communications means this analysis cannot be missed when the next development breaks. The military side of Operation Midnight Hammer was, on its own terms, an exhibition of planning discipline. A portion of the bomber package went west into the Pacific as deception, while the main strike force of 7 B-2s moved east with minimal communications, completed multiple refuelings over an 18-hour flight, linked with escort aircraft in a narrow timing window, and entered Iranian airspace under a suppression umbrella that appears to have worked exactly as designed. A submarine launched more than 24 Tomahawk missiles at roughly 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Dan Kane said Iran's fighters did not fly, and its surface-to-air systems apparently never saw the package. No shots were reported on the way in or on the way out. That matters because it separates two questions that political messaging tried to fuse into one. The United States clearly demonstrated unmatched penetration and precision. It did not automatically demonstrate that the political objective had been permanently secured. Tactical perfection at ingress and egress does not abolish the need for post-strike verification. It simply makes the verification more urgent because success at the outer layer can create overconfidence about the buried layer beneath it. Multiple independent outlets confirm what happened next. Satellite imagery showed 6 penetration holes in the mountain over Fordow, gray dust, disturbed terrain, and surface collapse around access points. Technically, that was exactly what the GBU-57 was designed to do. The 30,000-pound penetrator uses mass, casing strength, and a delayed fuse sequence to drive deep before detonation, with congressional reporting long describing penetration depths of up to 200 feet in hardened targets. In terminal descent phase, accuracy is not a cinematic flourish. It is the whole logic of the weapon. But weapons engineering and strategic outcome are not synonyms. The Reuters interviews with nuclear experts, the AP reporting on the leaked Defense Intelligence Agency assessment, and the BBC review of the same dispute all pointed to the same uncomfortable possibility. Entrances could be collapsed, surface infrastructure mangled, and underground halls still not fully destroyed. Enriched material could have been moved, centrifuges could remain largely intact, and what had been delayed by years in public language might have been delayed by months in classified language. That gap is where Trump's own generals enter the story, and not only the ones still in uniform. John Kelly, the retired Marine general who served as White House Chief of Staff, said Trump fit the general definition of a fascist and preferred the dictator approach to government. Mark Milley, the retired chairman of the Joint Chiefs, called him fascist to the core and the most dangerous person to this country. Jim Mattis reportedly agreed with that assessment. Those are not ordinary political defections. They are signals from the officer class that the commander's relationship with reality, hierarchy, and institutional restraint is itself a national security variable. When such figures watch a military operation turned instantly into a total victory myth, they recognize a pattern they spent years navigating from inside. Pressure for certainty before the evidence exists. Pressure for affirmation before the analysis is complete. Pressure to subordinate the chain of assessment to the chain of applause. The evidence requires acknowledgement that this pattern is not new. Battle damage assessment has always been iterative. During Desert Storm, pilot reports and imagery often diverged. In Kosovo, claimed Serbian armor kills were later revised downward after ground confirmation. In Iraq, missile strikes once credited with killing senior regime figures were later revealed to have missed their intended strategic effect. The mechanics are familiar to anyone who studies military tradecraft. Overhead imagery can show strike points, not always function loss. Signals intelligence can suggest disruption, not necessarily permanence. Human intelligence can fill gaps, but only if access survives the strike. In subterranean complexes, uncertainty multiplies. A mountain is not merely geology, it is shielding, redundancy, compartmentation, and time. Once a state anticipates attack, it disperses stockpiles, relocates technicians, seals shafts, and hides the most valuable components where sensors see least. That is why the most honest sentence Dan Kane uttered was not the description of severe damage, it was the admission of uncertainty. Trump, however, has always treated uncertainty as political weakness. That habit can dominate an election cycle, a press conference, or a licensing negotiation. It becomes dangerous when imported into war. The Guardian's analysis of the later Iran conflict described the core problem with unusual clarity. Trump's method has long been to construct a narrative, declare it true, and force institutions to organize around it. In Manhattan, boardrooms and television sets, that method can overwhelm objections because the cost of error is reputational and delayed. In war, error arrives with immediate invoices. It arrives in stockpile depletion, alliance strain, elevated insurance rates, mobilization orders, refinery shutdowns, intelligence leaks, and funerals. By March 11, 2026, administration officials told lawmakers the first 6 days of the Iran war had already cost the United States at least $11.3 billion, with $5.6 billion in munitions used in just the first 2 days. That is not messaging, that is expenditure. The public story then became even less coherent. J.D. Vance said the United States was not at war with Iran, but with Iran's nuclear program, and insisted there was no interest in regime change or boots on the ground. Hours later, Trump publicly floated regime change anyway. AP later cataloged how his messaging moved from total obliteration of the nuclear sites to claims that Iran had been close to a bomb, to threats framed around missiles, to earlier promises that Washington would come to the rescue of Iranian protesters, and then back again to arguments that only force could resolve the problem. That is not merely inconsistency of tone, it is inconsistency of declared objective. A military system can calibrate force against one objective. It cannot easily calibrate force against 4 changing objectives announced in public sequence. Officers trained to translate political guidance into operational design know that commanders' intent must narrow as action begins, not expand into improvisation. When that principle is violated, the narrative starts unraveling because each audience hears a different war being described. The technical layer of this story is what makes the narrative collapse so instructive. Trump's messaging machine wanted a binary outcome: destroyed or not destroyed, won or lost, strength or weakness. Military reality was analog, not binary. Fordow was a deeply buried enrichment plant built into a mountain near Qom. Natanz had underground halls and surface infrastructure. Esfahan included research facilities and tunnels. A bunker buster can defeat hardened geometry. It cannot guarantee perfect knowledge after impact. If 408.6 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium existed before the strikes, and about 42 kilograms could theoretically be enough for one bomb if further enriched to 90%, then the strategic question after the strike was never only crater count. It was survivable material, surviving centrifuges, reconstitution timelines, and covert breakout pathways. That is why cautious military language mattered. To pretend otherwise was to confuse blast effect with strategic resolution, a mistake as old as air power doctrine itself. And then the economics began speaking louder than the podium. 1/5 of global oil trade normally moves through the Strait of Hormuz. By mid-April 2026, Reuters reported cumulative Middle Eastern crude and condensate supply losses of 496 million barrels, with another Reuters analysis putting disruption above 600 million barrels and noting around 9 million barrels per day of Gulf production shut in. 45 days after Iran's Revolutionary Guards declared the strait closed, traffic remained far below the 130-plus daily crossings that had been normal before the war. Physical Brent moved to around $120 a barrel, and North Sea 40s briefly approached $150. In the United States, average gasoline hit $4.15 to $4.16 a gallon by April 11th, up from $2.98 before the war. Diesel reached $5.67. GasBuddy estimated an extra $10.4 billion in American gasoline and diesel spending from March 1st through April 10th, compared with the same period a year earlier. That is roughly $1.8 billion per week in additional fuel spending alone, before the supermarket, the airport, or the shipping invoice enters the frame. This is where the household translation becomes unavoidable. A direct military burn rate of at least $11.3 billion in 6 days is roughly $13.2 billion on a 7-day pace. Add about $1.8 billion a week in extra U.S. gasoline and diesel spending, and the weekly burden already exceeds $15 billion across only 2 measurable sectors. Then the secondary costs begin stacking. War risk premiums on tankers rose in some cases above 1,000%, with hull coverage moving from around 0.25% of vessel value to as high as 3%, implying about $7.5 million in war risk premium for a $250 million tanker instead of roughly $625,000 before the conflict. Jet fuel rose from about $99 a barrel at the end of February to as high as $209 in early April. Cathay Pacific lifted fuel surcharges by about 34%. Air India added as much as $280 to some tickets. Delivery services imposed fuel surcharges. A Wisconsin manufacturer told AP shipping costs had already risen 30% to 40%. Grocery prices had not yet fully jumped in March, but AP reported the mechanism plainly. Most food moves by truck, diesel feeds freight, and freight feeds the checkout line. The same multiplier effect is visible farther down the supply chain. Reuters reported that the Strait of Hormuz carries about 30% of globally traded fertilizers, and that Bank of America warned the conflict threatened 65% to 70% of global urea supplies, with prices already up 30% to 40%. Around 8 million kilograms of tea were stuck in warehouses at Mombasa because shipping routes were disrupted. In Europe, the International Energy Agency warned that some countries had less than 20 days of jet fuel cover, and that physical shortages could emerge once coverage fell below 23 days. This is how a war narrative breaks down in real economies. It is not only about missiles, bomb damage, or even nuclear timelines. It is about a farmer paying more for fertilizer, a trucking fleet paying more for diesel, a grocer paying more for freight, and a family paying more for produce and plane tickets at the same time. The administration could still speak in absolutes. The market was speaking in invoices. There was also a deeper military contradiction inside the sales pitch. Secretary Rubio emphasized Iran's ballistic missiles and bases under threat across the Gulf. Hegseth argued Iran was building missiles and drones as a conventional shield for nuclear coercion. Those were real concerns. But once those systems enter the analysis, the conflict is no longer reducible to a one-night strike on fixed sites. Ballistic missile forces, whether solid fuel or hypergolic liquid fuel systems, are resilient because launchers disperse, camouflage improves, and mobile logistics complicate kill chains. Drones absorb losses cheaply, proxies mutate. The more the administration widened the threat picture to justify escalation, the more it weakened the claim that a single wave had conclusively closed the file. Viewers can verify that chain independently against AODA pump data, airline fee notices, and public inflation releases. Subscribe to the channel right now because the pace at which developments diverge from official communications means this analysis cannot be missed when the next development breaks. There was even domestic demand destruction, the kind of metric that punishes every triumphalist briefing. Reuters reported U.S. gasoline demand in the week before Easter at just 8.6 million barrels per day, down 9% from the prior year's holiday level. One trucker in Houston described weekly diesel spending jumping to $1,600 to $1,700 from $800 to $900 before the war. A Shell station customer in Boston was paying $4.99 a gallon. GasBuddy said the fuel shock had added $10.4 billion to American gasoline and diesel spending over roughly 6 weeks, while Reuters also cited a 9% surge in pawn loan transactions after gasoline moved above $4. Those are not ideological indicators. They are stress signals. When households start cutting weekend trips, switching vehicles, delaying purchases, or pawning valuables, The narrative battle is already lost because citizens are no longer being asked to believe a story. They are being asked to ignore receipts. The broader strategic layer is even more punishing. Reuters documented oil output cuts of 7 million to 10 million barrels per day across the Middle East, or 7% to 10% of global demand. Iraq's southern output fell 70% to 1.3 million barrels per day from 4.3 million. The UAE's 922,000 barrel per day Ruwais refinery shut. Saudi Arabia cut 2 million barrels per day and suspended output at the 550,000 barrel per day Ras Tanura refinery. Middle Eastern refining capacity fell by 1.9 million barrels per day. Qatar, source of about 20% of global LNG, halted operations. Europe was left with maybe 6 weeks of jet fuel supply, and some countries with less than 20 days of cover. This is not abstract geopolitics. It is actuarial mathematics applied to escalation. Every interrupted tanker route, every delayed refinery restart, every insurance repricing decision multiplies outward through freight, fertilizer, aviation, food, and consumer sentiment. By April, U.S. consumer sentiment had fallen to 47.6. Inflation in March rose 3.3% year-on-year, with the largest monthly jump in gas prices in 6 decades helping push the monthly CPI increase to 0.9%. What Trump lost, therefore, was not merely an argument with a few news organizations. He lost the ability to monopolize the interpretation of events faster than the events themselves produced contradictory evidence. The DIA leak mattered because it exposed the fight between low-confidence intelligence and high-confidence politics. Dan Kane's caution mattered because it established an official military baseline that could not be easily reconciled with the language of total obliteration. Kelly, Milley, and Mattis mattered because they had already warned that Trump's instinct is to demand personalistic obedience from institutions designed to constrain ego with procedure. And the market mattered because markets are pitiless auditors. Oil futures, physical barrels, tanker traffic, war risk premiums, and pump prices do not salute. They register disruption. They punish overclaiming. They keep receipts. According to verified sources, by April 17th, oil could still fall 9% in a day on renewed hopes of Hormuz reopening. Yet even that relief came with warnings that normalization would take weeks, months, or in some shipping lanes around 10 weeks end-to-end once tankers, refineries, and product movement were accounted for. AP noted more than 150 tankers backed up in and around the strait. Reuters still counted only about 20 ships moving out during the brief easing. That is the strategic lesson in one image. A superpower can execute a brilliantly planned strike package with deception routes, stealth ingress, suppression fires, cyber support, and perfect weapons delivery, and still fail to control what the war means afterward. Because meaning is determined not at weapons release, but in the endurance of consequences. If Hormuz remains vulnerable, if enriched stockpiles survive, if the enemy adapts underground, if allies fear entrapment, and if domestic consumers pay $4 gasoline and rising grocery bills, then the information campaign collapses under the weight of its own excess claims. There is a final irony in all this. Trump often speaks of generals as instruments of will, as though military prestige can be borrowed to stabilize political mythology. Yet the generals closest to the facts, and the retired generals who know his habits best, have pointed in the opposite direction. One serving chairman warned the assessment was incomplete. Former senior commanders warned for years that Trump's appetite for domination exceeds his respect for institutions. The result is that the first defeat is not necessarily on the battlefield. It is in trust. Once trust is gone, every subsequent communiqué is interrogated harder, every casualty figure is doubted longer, and every declaration of success accelerates suspicion instead of confidence. And once that happens, every new briefing is measured not against the previous speech but against fuel gauges, shipping ledgers, and casualty notifications at home. That is what it means to lose the war for the narrative first. The next coverage will examine whether the Strait of Hormuz can actually be secured under partial ceasefire conditions, how quickly refinery and LNG flows can normalize, and whether Iranian reconstitution pathways now depend more on dispersed covert infrastructure than on known hardened sites. Subscribe to the channel right now because the pace at which developments diverge from official communications means this analysis cannot be missed when the next development breaks. Can current systems keep pace with what is being demonstrated, or is the architecture being tested beyond design limits?